Why are there so many accents? Hello everyone. Welcome back to Learn with Mark. How are you doing out there in podcast land? I hope you're doing all right today, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Okay, so you know that there's a wide variety of accents in the UK, not to mention the accents that you will find in other English-speaking countries like Ireland, Canada, the USA, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and more. So obviously there are accents that we associate with these different countries, but also within each country, there are many different accents too, particularly in the UK. English is a hugely diverse language, and in my experience, foreign learners of English don't usually know a lot about the different accents, particularly all the regional varieties in the UK, and they often just find it difficult to understand those different varieties. As a result, learners of English can't enjoy the great variety of sounds in English, the sheer diversity of character and personality that you get from the different varieties of English. Therefore, it's worth taking the time to talk about it on this podcast. You know, my general experience or my general opinion on this subject is that if you, as a learner of English, if you're familiar with, lots of accents, if you're able to understand lots of different versions of English, then your English will be that much stronger as a result. So this is such a big subject that to do it justice would require me to, write a whole book about it. And many people have. For example, David Crystal and Ben Crystal wrote a book called You Say Potato, which is a really great book. I've been listening to the audiobook version of it, and I listen to it again and again because it's full of useful information and stuff. You Say Potato by David Crystal and Ben Crystal is an example of a, big, thick book that covers the whole subject of accents. So, it's a big subject worthy of a whole book's worth of commentary. So, I'm not writing a whole book about it. Instead, I just do episodes about accents fairly regularly on this podcast in an effort to cover as much of the topic as possible. For example, I recently did some episodes about British accents that you hear in the Lord of the Rings films. I did 2 episodes about British accents in The Lord of the Rings, which gave me a chance to talk about the different associations that we have with different accents in the UK, and how those associations were used to provide some color and character to the movie versions of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings stories. I also did episodes recently about accents that you might hear in Glasgow. And also I spoke to Korean Billy about his videos on regional accents and dialects as well. Okay, so since uploading those episodes, I have noticed a few comments from listeners wondering why there are so many accents in the UK. So I've had a few comments from people going, "This is interesting. How come there are so many different accents considering the UK is quite a small country? We do have a lot of diversity, so why is that?" So, in order to try and answer that question, I've prepared this episode, which I hope will help you understand the whole thing a little bit more. So, the plan in this episode, or possibly episodes depending on how long this takes, the plan is to talk about these things. Okay. So I'm going to talk about why there are so many accents in the UK, how our accents develop as part of a natural psychological process, what this means for learners of English and for teachers of English as well. And also we'll listen to someone speaking in a Liverpool accent, and I'll help you to understand it. Right, so we'll listen to a sample of some speech in a Liverpool accent, which is going to sort of illustrate some of the things I'm saying, and I'll help you to understand that too. So, talking about accents but also listening to accents too. In this case, a Liverpool accent. So this episode is about the way that people speak. But it's also about history, psychology, how to learn English, what my friends sound like, and how to understand a football player from Liverpool. So how are all of these things connected? Well, listen on and you'll find out. So let's start, first of all, with the question of why do we have so many accents in the UK? And this is related to something called communication accommodation theory, okay? Now, one of the things I said in those episodes about Lord of the Rings was that there is a very wide diversity, a wide variety of accents in the UK, all right? And that your accent reveals lots of things about you, such as where in the country you're from and what social background you come from. So, for example, when I meet someone from the UK and they speak to me, immediately identi. I don't even do it consciously. Often it's just subconsciously. You pick up on the accent, and that starts to inform the way you understand that person, okay? We do sort of judge each other, even subconsciously, based on the way that we speak, okay? We shouldn't really make assumptions about people based on the way they speak, but we do. And the way that people speak often is an indicator of things like their social background and also, obviously, which part of the country they come from. But it's not just geography, it's also about sort of social background. An accent can reveal quite a lot about that. So remember when I say accent, this simply means the way that you pronounce the words that you're using. And if you remember from a recent episode, one of the things I mentioned was this quote from George Bernard Shaw, a writer. And the quote said, "It's impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him." That's a quote that I read out before, which, is basically a way of illustrating that English people judge each other based on the way they speak. For example, if someone speaks in a very posh, upper-class voice, some people might think, "Oh, bloody posh idiot," or something. Or if someone speaks with a very strong local accent, other people might immediately assume that they're working class or that they're uneducated or something like that. So we do make these assumptions about each other, unfortunately. Now, that quote from Bernard Shaw. It's impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him. That quote does give the impression that we all hate each other, doesn't it? It sounds like we all, one person speaks and everyone's just despising them. It sounds like we all hate each other. I don't really agree that that's the case. The point which is being made by that quote is that we just have prejudices about each other's accents, and that this is an expression probably of the class system in the UK. The class system which arguably still exists in the UK, all right? For example, middle-class people probably look down on people with strong regional accents, and maybe even resent people who speak with very posh accents, and so on. There's a certain level of judgment that goes on, right? That's what that suggests. Now, here's a comment from the Indian not long ago from a listener called Nick, who is a regular commenter in the comments section. Hello, Nick. So this is what Nick wrote. Nick wrote in response to one of the episodes about accents. He said, "What a complicated life there in the UK. Everyone resents each other because of their accents." Now, we don't really resent each other, but we do judge each other a bit. But, we also love each other's accents as well. And Nick goes on to say, "Wow, I never thought that accents in the UK had such an important role in people's lives." And yes, it's true, Nick. Yes, accents are fairly important indicators of our identity, but they're also a source of great fun and joy and amusement and celebration. And Nick says, Mark, thanks for this episode. You opened up the UK in a new way for me. Even though I knew about different accents in the UK and from your podcast as well, I somehow didn't realize the deep meaning of accents in English life. And Nick continues, and he says, but I don't really understand how it happened that you have so many accents in quite a small area. I can understand that different levels of society may have different words in their vocabulary, but why they should have such different accents, especially when they live in one city or region. Maybe it was people's desire to make something with a language, or at least with pronunciation, in order to somehow be unique from others. Like, for example, different groups of people or subcultures dress in certain clothes, or different nations have their own folk costumes to mark them out as being different. Maybe it's that. And again it continues. He says, this is a no. No, that's the end of Nick's comment. So he's basically saying, how come there's such diversity? Maybe it's like the way in which social groups dress differently as a way of expressing their group identity. Maybe it's that. Well, Nick, I think this is a really good question, and there are so many interesting aspects to the answer. And I'm now going to try and deal with that question. Okay, so why do we have so many accents in the UK? And if you don't believe me, just check out some of the videos on YouTube of, 30 British accents, or, some of the different videos that you can see where one person goes through all the different accents. Like, for example, I can do a quick version of it now. Like, for example, here's my, let's say I'm gonna say, would you like a cup of tea? Sit down. Would you like a cup of tea? How are you? Sit down. Would you like a cup of tea? All right. So in my voice, sit down. How are you? Would you like a cup of tea? Right? In a sort of Cockney voice, sit down. How are ya? Do you want a cup of tea? Do you want a cup of tea, mate? All right. That's a sort of Cockney London thing. Maybe Southwest. All right, my loves? You want a nice cup of tea? Sit down. That's a bit crap, wasn't it? Sit down. Would you like some tea? All right, my love. All right. In Birmingham, all right? All right. All right, mate. How's it going? How are ya? Do you want a cup of tea? Liverpool, always. Do you want some tea? Do you want a cup of tea? Comin' out to my house. I'll make you some tea. We'll sit down, we'll play some PlayStation. For example, Manchester. All right, mate. How's it going? Do you want some tea? Do you want a cup of tea, mate? All right. Newcastle. Do you want a cup of tea, man? Do you want a cup of tea? These might all sound the same to you because, as I said, you're not familiar with them, but, anyway, that's just a little sample of different accents. Alright, so how come we have so many accents? Now, this could be explained by something called communication accommodation theory, or CAT for short. This could be explained by a cat. Okay, I could just get a cat to come. Hey cat, come on. Come on. Come on, Whiskers. I don't actually have a cat here who's going to explain it. That would be good, to be honest. That would be really good if a cat, like literally a cat, came in and just explained it all to you. That would be amazing, right? That would be the best podcast or best YouTube video ever. Unfortunately, I don't have a cat to explain the accent phenomenon. But I do have a theory, which is called communication accommodation theory, or CAT for short. Now, accommodation. Let's just take out the word accommodation because you probably already know the word accommodation because you're thinking like hotels, apartments, places to stay. Like when you go on holiday, you need to book your accommodation. That's one meaning of the word accommodation. There is another meaning of it too. If we look at the Collins Dictionary online, you'll see that they define. This is the third definition of accommodation on the Collins Dictionary website. They say that accommodation is a kind of agreement between different people which enables them to exist together without trouble. Okay, so an agreement that's not a written agreement like a contract. But it's just a sort of social or psychological tendency for people to come closer to each other and form communities based on shared behavior. That's accommodation. That sense that people are kind of acting or behaving or communicating in similar ways as an expression of their community, right? Accommodation. People accommodate to each other, meaning that people sort of come closer to each other and form communities. If we look at the Wikipedia page for communication accommodation theory, it says that communication accommodation theory is a theory of communication developed by Howard Giles. Howard Giles is a professor of linguistics, I think. Let me just check, just to make sure that I'm saying the right things about Howard Giles. Howard Giles is a British-born professor of communication at the Department of Communication at the University of California in Santa Barbara in the United States of America. A British professor who works in America. He came up with the idea of communication accommodation theory. This theory argues that when people interact, they adjust their speech, their vocal patterns, and their gestures to accommodate to others. And this theory explores the various reasons why individuals emphasize or minimize the social differences between themselves and the people they're talking to through verbal and nonverbal communication. This theory is concerned with the links between language, context, and identity. It focuses on both the intergroup and interpersonal factors that lead to accommodation, as well as the ways that power macro and micro context concerns affect communication behaviors. And we talk about, in communication accommodation theory, we're talking about two processes, convergence, which is when people come closer together, and divergence, which is where people sort of emphasize the difference between them and other people. All right? It's all getting a bit academic, isn't it? What the hell are we talking about here? Okay, let's start with just accommodation. So it's the process by which people change the way they speak and the way they communicate in order to express the fact that they are part of a community, okay? So, for example, let's say when I lived in Japan, because I lived in Japan for a couple of years. And when I lived there, my body language changed a little bit over time because I started to accommodate to the cultural context. I started to accommodate to the Japanese people that I was talking to, every day. So I'd start to accommodate to that. Now, I didn't really learn Japanese very well, so it's hard for me to say that, my Japanese accent became really authentic or something. But a small example would be the way in which my body language changed. I mean, the way my body language changed. So, for example, I'd find that when I was talking to people, I would assume more Japanese-style body language, which would mean sort of not making as much eye contact as I would do in Europe, for example. Maybe sort of, nodding or bowing a lot more, and using certain hand gestures that they might use in Japan to mean sorry or whatever, you know? I'd accommodated, not even consciously, just subconsciously. My body language had changed a little bit because I accommodated to the context in Japan. All right. So that's an example of nonverbal communication accommodation, but also it works in our speech patterns as well. For example, when I lived in Japan, I used to work with a group of Australian people. They were other teachers in the school where I worked, and they were Australian. So I spent a lot of time hanging around, working, and socializing with this group of Australian guys. And, my speech patterns started to accommodate to Australians. So, I didn't develop a full-on Australian accent or anything. I didn't become Aussie, but just certain things. The typical example in Australia is the rising intonation, you know? That's rising intonation when your voice sort of goes up at the end like that, at the end of sentences. Now, obviously, Australian people don't do that all the time, but they do it a little bit more than, my friends back home in England. Kind of going up at the end of a sentence. Day, mate. Here you go. Are you teaching this class? Okay, for example. But anyway, rising intonation. So, I came back from Japan after having spent time with Japanese and Australian people, nodding and going up at the end of sentences. Basically, there's just two examples of how my communication accommodated to the people I was with. Now, imagine that sort of thing. Imagine that process. But, taking place throughout someone's life, taking place over generations as well, to the point at which whole communities of people are communicating and behaving in similar ways as a sort of expression of the fact that they belong to that community. That gives you an idea of how, this process can lead to specific accents being formed in certain areas. For example, if you live in Liverpool, you're going to converge with the other people in Liverpool as an expression of the fact that you belong to that community. And you're going to diverge, probably, from people in Manchester, let's say. Manchester, which is, another big city not far from Liverpool. But if you're in Liverpool, you'll be sort of proudly Liverpudlian. And you might support one of the Liverpool football teams. And you will associate yourself with Liverpool, not with Manchester. And you probably won't like Manchester United. And there are many factors like that that cause you to behave and act in a way that is the same as the group of people that you associate with. And that includes speaking in the Liverpool accent that your parents have and that the other people in your town have. Okay. So, communication accommodation theory suggests the way we communicate is an expression of our desire or our natural tendency to become part of a social group. Okay? Scott Thornberry. Scott Thornberry is, a well-known, English teacher and writer. He's written lots of really good books about English teaching. And he's kind of a bit of a legend in the world of English teaching. Scott Thornberry also wrote a blog article about this, and I'm kind of reading from this as well a little bit, or quoting from it. So this whole thing of communication accommodation theory, this could explain why there are so many different accents associated with different regions in the UK. For example, why people in Liverpool speak differently to people in Manchester, or why the Cockney dialect or Cockney accent came about. Now, I'll speak more about that in a moment. It could also explain why we naturally change the way that we speak depending on the people around us. It could explain why speaking to a diverse range of people and socializing, and actually speaking, Communicating to a diverse range of people is very good for your accent. And it could explain why native English speakers sometimes change the way that they speak when talking to foreigners. Okay? For example, when traveling or meeting a foreign person, sometimes you find that native English speakers adapt the way they speak without even realizing they're doing it, to the people they're speaking to. And that might explain why, for example, that might explain that your English teacher might not be speaking completely naturally to you in a classroom situation. Sometimes, not all teachers, but sometimes the tendency is to unconsciously adapt your communication style to the people you're talking to. So now I'm going to try and deal with these things. I'm going to try and talk about them in a bit more depth, okay? But not necessarily in that order that I've just given you there. Let's talk about this thing about why native speakers sometimes adapt their language when talking to foreigners. Okay. Now, according to Scott Thornberry, that published author of English teaching books, according to Scott Thornberry, there are two versions, two ways in which native speakers accommodate to non-native speakers when they're talking to them. Okay, there's two versions. He says there's caretaker talk and foreigner talk. So these two different things, caretaker talk and foreigner talk. And this is what he says. He says, quote, "This is especially obvious in the way that we talk to children and non-native speakers using forms of talk called caretaker talk and foreigner talk, respectively. Both varieties are characterized by considerable simplification, although there are significant differences. Caretaker talk is often pitched higher and slower than talk used with adults. So caretaker talk is the way that adults might talk to children. Are you all right? Do you know which class you're going to? Oh, look at that. That's a nice t-shirt. What's that? The way that adults talk to children sometimes, for some reason, when adults talk to children, their voice goes up like that, like, oh, that's a nice drawing. Aren't you clever? You would, if you spoke like that to an adult, they would think you were an idiot, right? Like if I spoke like that to one of my adult learners of English. Oh, look at those sentences. Aren't you clever? They'd hate me, right? It would be awful. So anyway, caretaker talk is speaking to children and adapting your speech to children. And then he says, this is a simpler version of English, but it's always, nearly always, grammatically well formed. But then there's foreigner talk, and that actually tolerates greater use of non-grammatical, pigeon-like forms. And that's the sort of English that English tourists use when they go to other countries. Like, okay, me wait you here. Okay, you like? You take me my wife to market, that kind of thing. You like drink. No, that's foreigner talk. Now, I've actually seen this kind of thing happening a little bit to some English teachers. And this is one of the things that English teachers have to be careful of. That they don't adapt their speech too much. That they don't start using foreigner talk. Because then they are presenting, a grammatically unsound version of English. But I have seen and heard English teachers doing that sometimes. I remember, for example, when I worked in Japan, I overheard a few teachers who were, not very experienced, not so qualified, because there are so many teachers out there who weren't really fully qualified, to be honest. And I remember hearing quite a lot of foreigner talk there. I mean, it's easy for the learners to understand, but it's not necessarily the most accurate form of English. So I have seen this happening, that some teachers, adapt their speech to the students speaking this weird form of English that's easy for foreigners to understand. but might not be helping them to learn, depending on the level, I suppose. Anyway, it's difficult to judge it correctly as a teacher, because sometimes you do have to grade your English when you're talking to low-level learners of English. But how much do you grade your language, and how do you do it is an important question for English teachers. It's important to speak correctly to learners of English, meaning sort of using the sort of full natural English that you would normally use. And in this, using it in the same way that most native speakers talk to each other. So it's important to do that, but also you've got to make sure that it's comprehensible, that it's easy for the learners to understand. And if you're too natural, your low-level students won't understand you, and they won't really learn. Whereas if you simplify your English too much, then you end up doing this kind of foreigner talk, which is not really a good model of the language. So I guess this is all part of being a good teacher, knowing how to strike the balance between being comprehensible and yet also being realistic and natural as well. Personally, I always try to keep those things in mind when I speak, and it's probably why my voice becomes more and more like standard received pronunciation, okay? Because I think generally what happens when I'm speaking on the podcast or when I'm speaking at work is I do try to speak as naturally as possible, but probably I end up speaking kind of clearly. Like I'm trying to pronounce words really, really clearly. And that's how I end up speaking this kind of BBC English sometimes. But I'm always consciously trying to keep it as natural as possible. Okay, but I certainly I'm not doing foreigner talk. Oh God. Oh no. Now, okay, so do I accommodate my English when I talk to native speakers with different accents? What about that question? For example, if I'm speaking to people from, certain parts of the country, do I accommodate when I'm talking to them? Well, yes, I do probably a little bit. I mean, I do accommodate to different accents, but I think that that's only when those accents are sort of part of my identity somehow. For example, I spent time growing up in London. I spent time growing up in the Midlands near Birmingham, and so, those accents are sort of in me a little bit. So, excuse me, so when I'm talking to people from those areas, then yeah, I probably do adapt my English a little bit and accommodate to those accents. They're not radical changes because I'm still being myself, but my speech does change a little bit depending on who I'm with. For example, when I'm back in Birmingham, my speech becomes a little bit more brummy. When I'm in London, it does the same. It becomes a bit more Londonish, but only a little bit, of course, and this is completely normal. But when I'm speaking on the podcast, I do just try and make sure I'm speaking really naturally and clearly and normally, probably with more influence from my London background than the Birmingham one, just because I spent more time living in London than in Birmingham. And in terms of the podcast, it's very important for me to speak to other people on the podcast, like to have guests and speak to guests on this podcast as well. Because it's in the interaction with other people that language really becomes most alive and natural. When I'm talking to you on my own, I speak in my neutral voice. But when I'm in conversation with others, you might hear my voice changing slightly just as I accommodate to the people I'm talking to. You might not even notice, to be honest, because it's often a pretty mild change. Perhaps it doesn't happen that much because I'm still aware that I'm being listened to by my audience. But if you want to check it out, if you want to try and decide for yourself whether I adapt my speech when I'm speaking to guests versus when I speak to my audience on my own like this, then you could check out some of the episodes in the archive. For example, you could check out the ones where I spoke my struggle for learning. My accent didn't really change that much. But maybe if I'd spent the weekend in London just hanging out and talking, my accent might have changed a little bit more. And I'm now gonna avoid mentioning the same thing about, when I worked with Australian people. I did pick up some of the accent from them because I spent a lot more time with them than just like an hour on a podcast. Certainly, when I'm back in Birmingham, my accent changes a bit because that's where I spent a lot of time when I was younger. For example, I don't know, "All right, mate, how's it going?" "All right, yeah, do you want a drink?" "Do you want a drink?" Yeah, do you want to join a pint?" "Come on, let's go to the pub." You know, you might not have noticed that, but okay, here's me doing it in London. "All right, mate, yeah, do you want to join a pint?" "Come on, let's go down the pub." That's London. And then when I'm in Birmingham, it might be like, "All right, mate, how's it going? You all right? Do you want to go for a drink? Come on, let's go down the pub." Okay, slight difference. Another question recently was from a listener called Cat. So that's not an actual cat. I don't have any cats listening to the... Well, I probably have some cats listening to the podcast. But I don't think they are commenting. I don't know if cats can do that. Anyway, I'm pretty sure they can't. Ridiculous. Anyway, Cat's question. Cat is one of the listeners who often leaves comments. Hello, Cat. Cat's question is, what are Paul and Amber's accents? Paul and Amber are friends of mine who are on this podcast quite a lot. Actually, I think we've answered this question in a recent episode. Basically, Amber and I think it's like this, right? Amber and I are pretty similar. The way that we speak is basically received pronunciation. Paul also speaks received pronunciation, but with a bit more of a local influence. I think he's from Kent, which is a county near London, so he speaks with some traces of a Kentish accent. For example, glottal stops, pronouncing T sounds. So, I'd say native speaker. Paul might say native speaker. I say excited. Paul might say excited. Okay, also some of the TH sounds. When Paul speaks, sometimes they sound a bit like D or V sounds. Like on the podcast, the not THE. Slight differences. For example, Amber and Paul are on the podcast. Amber and Paul are on the podcast. Da and thu. So I've heard Paul saying on the podcast a little bit more than I do. But really, we're splitting hairs here a little bit. Okay, all right, basically there's that. All right then, so what about accommodation theory and, an example? Okay, and Nick's original question about the diversity of accents in the UK. Well, I'm going to talk about that more specifically in a moment. Talking about this, maybe some answers as to why we have so many different accents. Accommodation theory might help to explain it, but I'll go into more detail about that first. In a minute. But first of all, let's check out a funny example of a professional footballer from Liverpool who moved to France, to play for Olympique de Marseille Football Club. And he did an interview on television in France, speaking to French journalists, and the video went a little bit viral because it was quite funny to see how this guy from Liverpool was speaking to a room full of French journalists, and he sort of accommodated his voice so that they could understand him. Let's see. This is Joey Barton. Joey Barton is basically a professional footballer, as I said. Okay. Joey Barton talking to the French press after his first game for Marseille. And let's see if you can notice the way that Joey Barton is adapting his English subconsciously to help the French people in the room understand him. As I say, yesterday I make one tackle. And it's not just his accent, it's also his grammar. He's accommodating his grammar, so he's kind of doing foreigner talk like we heard about earlier on in this episode. As I say, yesterday I make one tackle, and all everybody speak about is this tackle. Nobody speaks about a 50-yard pass that kills Beaumont and because a red card for him, and nobody talks about the shot that, Landreau would have been happy to see. You know, he didn't see the ball, never mind have a chance to save it. So for me, it's important that people speak about the qualities I bring as a footballer. And I'm a little bit bored, you know, from the English media. And hopefully the French media has more about it than the English media and concentrate on stupid little incidents like this maybe. Can you notice that? Can you hear the way he's sort of sounding a little bit French? Let's check out some of the examples of that happening. So yesterday I make one tackle. There you go. Yesterday I make one tackle. Should be yesterday I made one tackle. And now, this is not because Joey Barton is stupid or he's got bad English. He's not stupid at all. He might be a professional footballer, and we sometimes sort of make jokes about footballers not being very intelligent, but Joey Barton is a really clever guy. He's got like a slightly difficult past. I think he grew up in a really rough part of Liverpool. And for example, you know, I think his cousin was sent to prison for murder. And Joey Barton himself said that if he hadn't gone into football, he might have ended up, you know, in a similar situation. In fact, he did spend some time in prison. And he said that it really kind of made him think. And basically he's used football in order to get himself out of that kind of life. And I've seen Joey Barton appearing on television and speaking very eloquently and articulately, and he's obviously a very intelligent person. So it's not a question of his intelligence. It really is, though, a question of him accommodating his English to the people he's talking to. Well, and all everybody speak about is this tackle number. All everybody speak about, right? The only thing you know all that people are speaking about. And he's simplified it to all everybody speak about. All everybody speak about is this tackle. Nobody speaks about a 50-yard pass that kills Beaumont and it causes a red card for him. It caused a red card for him as well. He's almost like the accent is sounding a bit French. And nobody should talk about the shot that, Landreau would have been happy to see. You know, he didn't see the ball, never. He didn't see the ball. He's not saying, he's saying you didn't see the ball, which is something you kind of associate with a French accent a little bit. Boring, you know, I can understand, you know, I watch, Lille yesterday. They have 10-0, you know, they have 10 men. They have 10 men, okay? Not have but AV, he said. For me, you might as well lose 5-0 as 1-0, you know, it's still no point. He's Argentine, and I'm English, it's a big difference. He's Argentine, I'm English, it's a big difference, big difference. Okay, I mean that's just an example of Joey Barton. I tell you what, we can see him talking about that now. Well, you mentioned Le Classique there. Has your French got any better? Okay, Has your French got any better? This is Joey Barton on a talk show. Yeah, a little bit, obviously we don't. You're going to pull this in, we're going to have a look at it. So all the other presenters on the show are making fun of him, and sort of like teasing him for his dodgy accent. I'm surprised that people in France speak about this. It's normal in England, and maybe it takes me 1 or 2 games to adapt. For me, it's not a problem. See the way he goes, which is really French kind of body language. He's kind of like shrugging and going as well. And these are sort of bits of body language that we really associate with France. So he's even acting like a French person. One criticism of the French league is it's a little bit boring, and I cannot, this is kind of like French, I watched Lille yesterday. They have 10 men, and they're happy to lose 1-0, they have 10 men. And for me, you might as well lose 5-0 as 1-0. Perfectly fair, really. Yeah, perfect for the oldies like me. You could get you a job on Allo Allo. For the oldies like me, you could get you a job on Allo Allo. Allo Allo is a TV show. Well, you're very close to me there, aren't you? You can see me right up in my face. Ella, I was talking to the camera there, audio people. Allo Allo was a TV show which, was made in the UK. But it was sort of set in Belgium, and all the characters spoke with these terrible French accents. So he's making fun of him now. When that happened, I'm not. Clearly, what you're trying to do is you're trying to speak in a pattern that the European, the French journalists will understand. I get that. But were your mates onto you straight away? Well, I always remember I'm doing a conference. I was full of French journalists, no foreign journalists really in the room. And obviously I'm sitting at the top, and I had my brother and a really good pal of mine in tags, who were sitting in the back. I had my brother and a really good pal of mine. I had my brother and a really good friend of mine sitting in the back. I had my brother and a really good pal of mine sitting in the back. I had my brother and a really good pal of mine. I had my brother and a really good friend of mine at the top, and I had my brother and a really good pal of mine tags, who were sitting in the back. Hope you have enjoyed the reading. Bye for now.